I'm now thrilled to introduce the rest of our panel. Mary Pat Hector is an Atlanta native, a graduate of Spelman College, and a current graduate student at Georgia State University. When she was 19, she became the youngest woman and person of color to run for public office in the state of Georgia. Mary Pat currently serves as the Georgia Black Youth Vote Coordinator, an organization mobilizing college students to be active in civic engagement. And she recently organized an amazing march, the Say Her Name March, to call for justice for Breonna Taylor and other Black women killed in police violence. Liliana Matia, an Atlanta native, is committed to advocating for human rights around the globe, advocating for women's health and children's health, refugee resettlement, environmental justice, and against human trafficking. As someone who is often the victim of discrimination due to her race, religion, and gender identity, she uses an interdisciplinary approach to promote social justice. She first ran for office in 2017 and is a graduate of Georgia State and Director of Social Justice Research for ECHO Market Research. Maria del Rosario Palacios is an immigrant workers' rights community advocate, public speaker, and small business owner. She was born in Mexico to two migrant farm workers who arrived in the United States after they were recruited to work in tomato fields in the mid-1980s. Maria has run for office twice since becoming a naturalized citizen. She made national media headlines in 2018 for challenging the Georgia Secretary of State's definition of Georgia citizen after being taken off the ballot for being newly naturalized. Thank you all so much for being a part of this discussion, because while we are being inspired by the past, we want to use that inspiration to move forward in the future. And you all are so much the future of political and civic engagement and protecting our democracy. So my first question is, why did you want to be involved in the political process? And we'll start with Mary Pat.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Really, the reason why I wanted to get involved in politics was because I was already involved in community organizing and activism. I started at a very young age, and I began to realize that bringing awareness to issues and mobilizing around issues are important, but the real way to change is through policy. And so I knew that if I was going to be in the streets making noise, I also needed to be under the Gold Dome or involved in politics in any way that I can, both locally and at the major level within our political system. And that's really what made me want to get involved in politics.
Great. Thank you. Liliana?
Hey, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Very similar to what Mary Pat said. I started marching in the streets with my dad when I was about 8. He was a survivor of the revolution in Iran and got me involved in politics at an early age. And sometimes when you're a minority, you're just kind of born into politics because sometimes just existing is a form of protesting. So I got involved in that, and then I did crisis relief work. By the time I had 18, I was doing crisis relief work all over the world and recognized that there wasn't much of a difference between what I was seeing abroad in underdeveloped countries and what I was seeing here at home in parts of Atlanta, and with people that are living below the poverty line. So I decided to come back home and build a stronger foundation here. And I realized the best way to do that was by helping shape legislation, which is what led me to run for office in 2017, which was right after the Muslim ban, which also affected my family. And I really felt like it was the only way to protect them was to be getting involved in shaping local policy and legislation, which is what led to me to run and which is what continues to lead me to wanting to remain involved.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the Muslim ban. There have been so many challenges that have come about in the last 3.5 years that sometimes we have to go back and recount how many incredible challenges we've been confronted with. So thank you for lifting that up. That was my first couple of weeks as executive director of the ACLU of Georgia. So
What an uncomplicated time to start.
yes, yeah. Maria, what prompted you to run for office?
Yes, so definitely, I think I was always pretty geeky about watching C-SPAN as a young 12-year-old. But I would say really the first thing that got me into organizing on a more formal scale was an acknowledgement of at-large voting in Gainesville, where I was raised and still live. Knowing that at-large voting was disenfranchising the large community of color, we're a majority people of color city, knowing that that was something that was really holding us back really got me engaged back in 2012. You know, from there, just the day-to-day life of being a single parent, knowing that childcare policies in our state don't let folks like me try to advance, try to finish college or work without having to pay sometimes more than what you can earn out of college, right? So seeing those cycles of debt and now seeing the impact of COVID-19 in Gainesville is what keeps me here because I know there's policies tied to what infrastructure is there for healthcare, what availability there is for even taking sick leave. All of it's so closely tied. So these day-to-day things is what brought me into politics.
Right. Yeah, these are excellent points because so often people say, well, why does it matter? But one of the things we wanted to bring out in the women's report and that we want to really get lifted up in this discussion is that, especially in our state legislature, people are making decisions that affect exactly those things. You know, what is the access to health care? What is the access to sick leave? What is the access to childcare? Um, and so, really helping people understand that your vote can affect those things that are so much a part of your everyday life. And that's why I think it's so important that women lift up voices because whenever they balance the budget, it's more work for some women, for women in our community. You know, they tend to cut the things that then fall to us to fill in the gap. So Mary Pat, I know you have really been an activist, organizing marches and working with the National Action Network. And what we see now in this era of Black Lives Matter, the sort of renewed activity since the tragic killings of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, of Rashard Brooks, of Sandra Bland. I mean, that we um, are reminded that we do have a new moment. And we've seen sometimes that, I think we've seen some of the signs that say we are not our parents, or, some of the things our parents negotiated, we want to renegotiate some of those agreements. So, what are some of those agreements? What is some of that status quo that's got to be renegotiated from the perspective of particularly, young women of color today who are active and who are challenging all of us we saw some incumbents defeated in the recent primary. What are some of the challenges and what are some of your aspirations for your own leadership or for what elected leaders need to do in Georgia if they're going to meet the challenge that's coming from your generation? Mary Pat?
Really, for women of color's voices to be heard. You know, one of the biggest issues or biggest concerns or complaints that we've heard from women in this movement now is that historically women of color have been silenced. When you think about the civil rights movement or you even think about Black Lives Matter, it seems to be very male centered. And Black women are saying, you're not going to forget about me. Breonna Taylor is that person for us. And that's why we held the march here in the city of Atlanta to say Black women have been mobilizing and organizing for everybody, whether it be for Black men or white women. And you're not going to continue to erase us or our voices. And our issues deserve to be heard. And so when we talk about renegotiating things that our parents, our grandparents, not even our parents, our grandparents might have implemented, historically, that Black agenda was very male centered and very male focused. And so we are demanding that, if we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, we want to ensure that all Black lives matter. The lives of Black women, Black trans women, that all of our voices are heard, and we can all receive equality in this country. And we need
Absolutely.
leadership. We need leadership like women. We need our leadership in our elected offices to look like this country, and look like the people who vote. And we know Black women show up and show out for everyone, especially when it comes to voting.
Absolutely. Liliana, I know many of your issues are intersectional, and your approach to them is multidisciplinary, which is quite amazing, the kind of work that you've done. But, talk about your aspirations for elected leadership in Georgia.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of them. I mean, one of the things I really, really would love to see more disruptors, and us not demonizing those who are willing to stand up and do the work that it takes to disrupt. I think there's been, as we saw when we were battling HB 481, we had Black female legislators stand up in in the house, in the state house, and speak out. And a lot of people are like, well, there were a lot of white Republicans who would have voted against the bill had you just not done that, or in literal terms, just behaved. So this idea of expecting women of color and those who are elected to play by white patriarchal rules and values, and that somehow that will go our way. I'm tired of that narrative. I think we all are tired of that narrative. It's why we see people resorting their frustrations to, while people are marching and taking back the streets, and you have leaders like Mary Pat who are standing up, and Maria, and like those of us who are getting tired of waiting our turn and are standing up to do things. Like, so yes, we want to see more diversity in elected officials, but I also want to see elected officials not scared to stand by us when we're in the streets marching and asking of these things, because it's not well behaved. Because when we do things like it, I'm not going to be the person that's in the streets destroying property. But when we tell people, and we tell black protesters, and we tell people of color, and we tell nonconforming and trans folks that you broke a window at a bank, and how dare you do that? But yet the murderers of Breonna Taylor and of Rayshard Brooks and these other individuals are not facing the same sentencing. They're not facing repercussions that equal their actions. But we're going to come after you for that. What are we telling people their values are? So I want to be able to see, like, yes, like diversity and leadership, absolutely. But I want to see those leaders not afraid to stand by us, and for those who claim to be allies to Black and brown causes, to not silence the Black leadership and leadership of color that's already in place and expect them to quote unquote behave, because that in itself is just perpetuating oppression. And that just can't happen anymore. So I really need our leaders, our Democrats that are already in power, to stop being afraid, because lives are on the line more so than they ever have been. So that's what I would like to see.
Yes, as it was often said, well-behaved women seldom make history. And so much of what women do, there's so much we hear about policing of tone, and if you listen to all of these parameters that people want to put around, particularly women's engagement, you just tie yourself in knots. But I think those questions are yes.
You have one other thing. I think that also the biggest thing is to pay homage and understand that we are standing on we are all standing on the shoulders of the Black and brown women that have come before us, and especially the Black and brown trans women, because those are the originators of pretty any progressive movement we see today. It started in those communities, and we need to pay credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
So that as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Maria, what would you like to see, particularly, and I think this also goes for Liliana, I think we see often in our state politics, a failure to understand that, the Georgia's economy is so much a part of the global economy. And so when we see this, when we see issues around immigration, you know, lacking that understanding that our state's economy is part of the global economy. It is not something that is separate. And your family's story is certainly a part of that narrative that it seems like so many of our leaders fail to comprehend that contribution, how essential the presence and the ability for people to move back and forth between the global, not just the global north, but also the global south, into our communities for us to be vital. But talk about your aspirations for newly elected leaders in Georgia.
Thank you. So definitely, I think in Georgia we have so many things we can celebrate. We can celebrate definitely our contribution as a state, and I think often it's said, being the number one state to do business. And when you look at agricultural and you look at the poultry industry and its current contribution right now to the national economy, the national food supply chain, I think there's things to celebrate. And I think as we celebrate those things, we can also celebrate the essential workers in poultry plants, like my parents, like my siblings, like I used to be when I worked in poultry plants. I know the day-to-day looks of that. I know the struggles. I know how difficult it is to pull out of poverty. So those are really the things that I would love to see our elected officials continue to take with them, their whole selves. They're so amazing. There's such an amazing amount of candidates who bring a diverse set of not just formal experience, but lived experience, because it would take decades of academic theory to truly understand why Black Lives Matter, right? To truly understand the immigrant struggle and the immigrant progress from different fields, from tomato fields to organizing fields, right? So those lived experiences are valid, and I ask that newly elected officials bring in them with them to the state legislature and to the congressional races that they're in and everywhere else, a diverse set of folks that will help them. I think often of amazing people like Representative Renita Shannon, Representative B. Wynn, Representative Brenda Lopez, who was the first Latina elected to office. The number of folks that she would bring into the state capitol is amazing. Not folks that had to have a whole wealth of formal experience, but they learned what they needed to learn and they shared their lived experience. I ask that newly elected officials continue to take that into consideration and continue to bring in with them as thought partners additional folks with these kinds of shared experiences.
Great, thank you. So let's close. I'd like to hear from each of you. What would be two things that you would want to see if your vision for women's suffrage was fulfilled? What would be sort of two accomplishments that would um, occur because of that? Mary Pat, are you on mute? Yes, two things from that would we would find if your vision for women's votes were. You got it?
So yes,
Okay.
more
Yeah,
women
yeah.
elected, and more women elected, but also more women of color, young women, right? Giving them an opportunity to lead, them working together because we understand that women rule the world. So more women, but secondly, an emphasis on younger women, giving them an opportunity to lead, working hand in hand because they make the world a better place.
Great. Liliana?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on what Mary Pat just said, our women in leadership that have paved the way for us that are older, having a succession plan in place, really working with younger women to uplift them so that we're not turning against each other, so that we can actually see a united front in progressive causes, so that we're making sure to continue building that bench and having a plan in place, that we see a continuation of the building blocks that were put in place by the people before us. And yes, not just more women elected, but a diversity in women elected. Want to see more Black and Brown women elected. I want to see non-conforming women elected, queer women elected, gender fluid, trans women elected. being a greater diversity in that, and really encouraging the disruptors to feel like they have a place to talk and working with them rather than us operating in silos.
Great. Maria.
So I'll say two things. I don't want to repeat what the amazing panelists here have already said. I will say one. I think we need to put funds behind women of color so that one, they can get into office, and two, they can stay in office. It's extremely expensive to do both things, and we need to provide the livelihoods that women of color who aren't always in the decision making table, provide the livelihoods that they deserve and that they need to be able to fulfill their roles. Secondly, it's also other immaterial things. We need policy changes around our childcare, our school system, different things that women show up in leadership, not just at work, not just in policy making, but then we go home and do it all over again. So we need to back up women in immaterial policies that build those kinds of structures in and outside the home.
Yeah. Thank you. Melita.
I think the first thing I'd like to see is that this state needs to have a woman governor, a woman lieutenant governor. We need to return to a woman secretary of state. And I want us to see us elect these women who are currently Democratic candidates for Congress. But I think the fact that Nikema Williams was selected for the nomination when John Lewis's seat became available at his death, it shows us how important it is to have younger women on the bench, that we have a strong bench that future congressional vacancies can be filled from, that future statewide office candidates can come from. And I applaud everything that y'all have said about diversity. There's one area of diversity that is not often mentioned. Number one, we've got to keep some of the senior women there so that they have the seniority to be committee chairs, because we want women as committee chairs. But one other place of diversity I'd like to see is to have more women of color who are attorneys in the General Assembly. Right now, the women attorneys in the state Senate are all white women. There's not a black woman attorney in the state Senate, and there's only one practicing black woman attorney in the state House. And when Brenda Lopez ran for Congress, we lost a Latina woman as an attorney. Although now we have Zulma Lopez, who is a Latina woman who will be an attorney in the state House. But if we're going to talk about social justice reforms, criminal justice reforms, those black and brown women attorney voices need to be at the table with the power to offer amendments and be a part of the debate. So those are two areas, maybe three, I guess you'd say, that I would like to see.
Well, thank you all for this very rich discussion. Really important challenges, really important information. We are taking notes. We will share this, and we hope to really continue this work to build a movement where we are looking at and getting out of the silos and looking at the many umbrella issues that bring all women in Georgia together to promote our equality and our aspirations and our needs, frankly, and that we have a state that our politics actually, I was raised to believe that politics, is where they divide up the pie. And as they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we've got to make sure that women's issues are first and foremost, in the highlight of our politics. And the way to do that is for women to run, for women to be engaged, for women to vote. We do vote, but we now have to start holding people accountable for policies that reflect our priorities and what we voted for.